I never expected that the best news of my life would lead me to the worst moment of it. The drive back from Calgary took me through the kind of scenery that makes you remember why you chose to stay in Alberta your whole life. The Rocky Mountain foothills rolling past my window, the golden afternoon light catching the wheat fields just right, the October air so crisp and clean, it almost hurt to breathe. I had the radio off. I just wanted to sit in the silence and hold on to what the doctor had told me that morning. Clear, all clear. 18 months of checkups, of holding my breath every time the lab called, of watching my wife try to hide the worry in her eyes, and it was over. The tumor they had found in my left kidney had not returned. Dr. Hargreaves had shaken my hand and said I could start living like a normal man again. I remember I sat in the parking lot of the Foothills Medical Center for almost 20 minutes before I could drive. I just stared at the steering wheel and thought about my wife. I wanted to surprise her. We had a standing tradition from early in our marriage. Whenever something good happened, the one who knew first would come home with a bottle of that Okanagan Riesling she loved and 2 glasses already set out on the kitchen table. No announcement, no big speech. Just the wine on the table and a smile that told the other person everything they needed to know. I stopped at the liquor store in Cochrane and bought the nicest bottle they had. Then I drove the rest of the way home to Bragg Creek, feeling lighter than I had in years. Our property sits on just over 3 acres at the end of a gravel road. The kind of place you spend 30 years building into something that feels like it was always meant to be yours. My wife and I had bought the land when we were both still working, her as a school librarian in the Rocky View School Division, and me running a small excavation company. We built the house in stages, adding the back porch the year our son was born, the detached garage when he was in high school, the vegetable garden after we both retired. Every corner of that property had our hands in it. I turned off the highway onto our road just after 4 in the afternoon and immediately felt something was wrong, though I couldn't have told you why. Maybe it was the unfamiliar gray Escalade parked beside my son's truck at the end of the driveway. Maybe it was the fact that both vehicles were there at all. My son had told us he and his wife were spending the week at their place in Airdrie. I sat at the bottom of the driveway for a moment, engine idling, just looking at the house. Then I put the bottle of Riesling in my jacket pocket and walked up to the front door. I didn't knock. It was my house. The first thing I noticed was the sound. Laughter from the kitchen. Loud. Relaxed. The kind of laughter that comes from people who feel completely at home somewhere. I recognized my son's laugh. There were other voices I didn't know as well lower. A man and a woman. Older by the sound of them. Then I walked past the living room doorway and I stopped. My wife was sitting in the armchair by the window, the one she always curled up in to read. She was not reading. She was not doing anything. She was sitting very still with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes red and her face turned toward the window, and she was crying so quietly that from the hallway you almost wouldn't notice. Almost. I stepped into the living room and she looked up, and the expression on her face broke something open in my chest. She wasn't surprised to see me. She wasn't relieved. She looked like a woman who had been trying very hard to hold herself together and had just run out of strength to keep doing it. "What's wrong?" I said. I kept my voice low. She shook her head, started to say something and couldn't. I crossed the room and crouched down in front of her chair and took her hands in mine. They were cold. "Tell me," I said. She glanced toward the kitchen. The laughter continued, my son's voice rising with some story he was telling, the other voices responding. "They want us to sign the property over," she whispered. I looked at her. "To Daniel and Melissa," she said. "His father-in-law has been here since 2 o'clock. He brought his wife. They've been sitting at our kitchen table for 2 hours explaining why it makes financial sense." I stood up slowly. "Where are the papers?" "On the table." She reached for my hand again. "Robert, please don't. I'm not going to do anything," I told her. And I meant it. Because in that moment, standing in my own living room looking at my wife's red eyes, something in me went very quiet and very steady. Not angry. Not yet. Just clear. I walked to the kitchen. My son was sitting at the head of our kitchen table, my chair, the one I had sat in for 27 years with a mug of coffee in front of him and his phone face down on the table. His father-in-law sat across from him, A large man in a pressed shirt with the look of someone who had spent a lot of years getting his own way. His wife was beside him, pleasant-faced and saying nothing. My daughter-in-law Melissa sat next to my son with her hand on his arm. There was a folder on the table. Several pages fanned out from it. All four of them looked up when I walked in. "Dad," my son said. He had the grace to look uncomfortable at least. I looked at the papers on the table. Then I looked at my son's father-in-law, whose name was Gerald. I had met him 3 times at family occasions and found him perfectly civil each time. "I wasn't expecting you back until Thursday," my son said. "Clearly," I said. Gerald cleared his throat and sat forward slightly. "Robert. Good timing, actually. We were just going over some options that I think you'll find are actually quite—" "Why is my wife crying in the living room?" I asked him. He paused. "She's just emotional," Melissa said quickly. "It's a big decision. She just needs some time." "My wife," I said again very evenly, "is sitting in the next room crying, while you're all in here laughing." I looked at my son. "While you're in here laughing." He had the decency to look at the table. Gerald tried again. He was a man who was used to negotiating, and he fell back on it instinctively. He explained that Daniel had come to him several months ago about some financial difficulties, significant ones. He used the phrase leveraged investments, which in my experience has always been a polite way of saying that someone has lost money they didn't actually have. The amount he mentioned was not small. Daniel and Melissa had already exhausted their own savings and taken a second line of credit on their house in Airdrie, and they were still short by a considerable margin. The solution Gerald was proposing was straightforward, he said. My wife and I would transfer the Bragg Creek property into Daniel and Melissa's names. In exchange, Daniel's debt to Gerald, because that was what it was, a personal loan Gerald had extended to his son-in-law, would be written off. My son would essentially be paying his father-in-law back with my land. "You'll still be able to live here," Gerald added. "There'd be a life tenancy arrangement written into the transfer. Nothing changes for you day to day." I picked up the folder from the table and looked at the top page. It was a transfer of title document, already filled in, with a notary's stamp at the bottom. Beside the signature lines, someone had written our full names in pencil as a guide. "Who prepared this?" I asked. "I have a solicitor in Calgary," Gerald said. "He specializes in estate and property planning. This is all completely above board." I set the folder back down. I looked at my son. He met my eyes for a moment and then looked away. "Dad, the numbers don't work any other way," he said. "We've been through everything. We can't." "How much do you owe?" I asked him directly. He told me the number. It was more than I had expected even after Gerald's explanation. A little over $240,000. I knew without asking that it was almost certainly in US dollars given the type of investment he had described, which made the Canadian figure worse. "When were you going to tell me about this?" I asked him. He didn't answer. I looked at Gerald. "I'd like you to leave now," I said. "Both of you." Gerald's expression shifted. He was still perfectly polite, but something behind his eyes hardened. He said he understood this was a lot to process, that he was happy to give us time to review the documents, that his solicitor could walk us through any questions we had. He said the offer was generous. He said that family looked after family. "My family is in the living room crying," I said. "I'd like you to leave my house." Gerald and his wife left. Melissa followed them out, and I heard her saying something in a low voice in the front hall before the door closed. Then my son and I were alone at the kitchen table. He tried to explain. He had made a series of investments through a private fund that turned out to be, in his words, more volatile than advertised. He had tried to recover the losses by putting more in. Gerald had offered to cover what remained when it became clear Daniel couldn't. He had thought he could get the money back before anyone needed to know. "How long has your mother known?" I asked. He looked at the table. "Gerald called her last week. While you were in Calgary." I thought about my wife sitting in that living room for a week with this knowledge, watching me go to my medical appointments in Calgary, not wanting to add to what I was already carrying. I thought about her sitting in her chair this afternoon with Gerald and his wife at her kitchen table for 2 hours, and my son laughing in her own home while she cried alone. I told my son to go home to Airdrie. I told him we would talk when I was ready to talk. He started to say something else, and I held up my hand and he stopped. He left. I went back to the living room and sat on the arm of my wife's chair, and she leaned into me without saying anything, and we stayed like that for a long time while the October light faded outside the window. That night, after she had gone to bed, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea going cold in front of me, and I thought very carefully. I am not a man who makes decisions in anger. Running a business for 30 years teaches you that the worst choices are always the ones made when you're still hot. I had watched other men blow up their companies, their marriages, their relationships with their children, because they reacted instead of responded. I had always been the one who waited, who gathered information first. What I knew was this: my son had made a serious mistake. He had compounded it by hiding it, by letting Gerald approach my wife directly, by being in this house today without telling me, by sitting at my table laughing while his mother cried in the next room. Those were not small things. What I also knew was this: Gerald was not finished. A man like that, with that much money owed to him, does not accept leave my house as a final answer. He would come back, and the next time, he might come at a moment when I wasn't there. The property title was registered in both my name and my wife's under a joint tenancy arrangement, which meant neither of us could transfer it without the other's signature. That was the first piece of solid ground I stood on. The second was that I had never, in 30 years of running a business, signed anything without my own solicitor reviewing it first. Gerald knew nothing about that habit. But there was a third thing I had been carrying for about 4 months that I had not yet told anyone, including my wife. Not because I was keeping secrets from her, but because I had been waiting for the right moment, and the right moment kept not arriving. When I was first diagnosed, I had gone to see a lawyer in Calgary named Patricia Chen, who handled estates and property. I had wanted to make sure that if things went badly for me medically, everything was structured clearly for my wife's protection. During those conversations, Patricia had suggested putting the property into a family trust, with my wife and me as the trustees and beneficiaries during our lifetimes. It would mean the property no longer appeared in our personal names on title. It would be held by the trust. I had signed those documents in July. My wife had signed them. Patricia had registered the trust in August. Gerald's solicitor had pulled the title search. Clearly, because the transfer document they had prepared had our names on it. Our personal names, which meant they had pulled a search that was now 4 months out of date, before the trust registration had gone through. The property Gerald was trying to get my son to hand over did not legally exist in the form they thought it did. The transfer they had prepared was worthless. I sat with that knowledge for a long time. In the morning, I called Patricia Chen. She was quiet for a moment after I explained the situation. Then she said, "Robert, what they've attempted to do presenting a transfer document to your wife without your presence, applying pressure over a period of hours that has some serious implications." She asked me several questions about the timeline, about whether my wife had been asked to sign anything, about the exact nature of Gerald's loan to my son. I asked her what our options were. She said we had several. Over the following 2 weeks, I did what I have always done in difficult situations. I gathered information quietly, and I did not let on that I was doing it. I called Daniel and told him I needed to understand the full financial picture before we could have a serious conversation. He was cooperative in a way that told me he was relieved someone was taking charge. He sent me documents. I went through them with Patricia and with an accountant I trusted in Cochrane named Brian, who had handled my business accounts for many years. What emerged was more complicated than I had expected, and in some ways less bad than I had feared for my son, and in other ways, significantly worse. The investment losses were real, and they were serious. But the loan from Gerald was not a clean personal loan between family members. There was a written agreement, and when Brian looked at it, he pointed out several clauses that were, in his words, highly unusual for an informal family arrangement. The interest rate was not 0, as Daniel had believed. It was fixed at a rate that would have been more appropriate for a commercial bridge loan. There was a personal guarantee clause that extended beyond the principal amount. And there was a clause buried near the end in language that Brian had to read 3 times before he was sure he understood it, that allowed Gerald to pursue any real property assets held by Daniel or his immediate family members in the event of default. My son had signed this document without having a lawyer look at it. He had trusted his father-in-law. I drove to Airdrie on a Tuesday afternoon and sat at my son's kitchen table, a different kitchen table, a different conversation, and I put the document in front of him with the relevant clauses highlighted in yellow. He read it. He read it again. He told me it was just a formality. He said, "It always is," I said, "until it isn't." My son looked older sitting there than I had ever seen him look. He was 41 years old, and he looked like a man trying to remember who he was, before he had made a long series of small, wrong turns. I had been angry at him. I was still angry at him in the way that you stay angry at someone you love even after you have decided to help them. But I also remembered being 41. And I remembered the specific quality of humiliation that comes from having to sit across from your father and admit that you have made a serious mess of things. "I'm going to need you to do exactly what I tell you," I said. "Nothing more and nothing less. Can you do that?" He said yes. Patricia had been busy. Working with Brian, she had put together a full picture of the loan agreement and its legality under Alberta law. There were questions, she said carefully, about whether certain clauses in the document could be enforced, given how they had been presented to my son and what had been represented to him about the nature of the agreement at the time of signing. She had also made some inquiries about Gerald's background in a professional context that had turned up information she was not yet ready to share with me, but that she said I should be aware existed. What she told me to do was this: say nothing to Gerald. Let him make the next move. Wait. It took 3 weeks. Then Gerald's solicitor sent a formal letter to my son's address in Airdrie, with a copy addressed to my wife and me at the Bragg Creek property, advising that the loan was being called in full, and that if full payment was not received within 30 days, Gerald would be pursuing his legal remedies, including any property interests covered by the personal guarantee clause. I had been expecting it. I had the response ready. Patricia filed on our behalf. The trust documents, properly registered since August, made the Bragg Creek property entirely unavailable as a remedy under Daniel's personal guarantee. It was not, and had not been for months, a personal asset of either my son or of my wife and me in the form that the guarantee covered. Patricia also filed a separate application raising questions about the enforceability of the loan agreement itself, given the circumstances under which it had been signed and the representations that had been made to my son at the time. And she sent a separate letter directly to Gerald personally, not to his solicitor. I had written most of it myself, though Patricia had refined the language. It reviewed, in precise and documented detail, the events of the afternoon Gerald and his wife had spent at our home. The 2 hours of pressure applied to my wife in my absence, the pre-prepared transfer documents, the fact that my wife had been in a state of distress that had been visible to multiple parties. Patricia noted that presenting transfer documents to one co-owner of a joint property without the other co-owner's knowledge or presence, with the deliberate intent of obtaining a signature while the absent co-owner was unavailable, raised questions that she believed Gerald would not want to see ventilated in a public proceeding. She suggested that Gerald might want to take some time to reconsider his position. I will not pretend there was no satisfaction in that. Gerald's response, through his solicitor, came 10 days later. The loan call was withdrawn. The personal guarantee clause, Gerald's solicitor wrote, had been reviewed in light of the specific circumstances of its execution, and Gerald had determined that he did not wish to pursue that particular remedy. There was language about a willingness to renegotiate the repayment terms on a schedule that reflected Daniel's actual financial situation. What it meant, in plain terms, was that Gerald had looked at what Patricia had in her files and decided that none of it was worth the exposure. I drove to Airdrie again. I sat at that kitchen table again, with my son and his wife across from me. My daughter-in-law had barely spoken to me since the afternoon at our house, and I understood that her father was a complicated figure for her, and this had put her in an impossible position, and I was not interested in making it more impossible. I told them both what had happened and what it meant. There was going to be a repayment plan. It would take years. It would be hard on them. There would be no shortcuts and no bailouts from our side. My wife and I had talked about this at length, and we were in complete agreement. We would not contribute money, and we would not offer the property as any kind of collateral or guarantee under any circumstances. What we would do was give Daniel the name of a financial advisor in Calgary we trusted and a bankruptcy lawyer if he needed one, and we would not add shame to an already difficult situation. But I needed something from him. I needed him to understand, not as an adult child receiving a lecture, but as a man sitting across from another man, what the afternoon in our living room had cost. What it had cost his mother to sit in that chair with strangers at her table, in her home that she had built with her own hands and her own 30 years of work, while her son sat in the next room and laughed. I told him that. I told him all of it, without raising my voice. He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said he was sorry. He said it the way people say it when they mean it, without qualifications, without explanations attached. Just the words. Plainly. I know, I said. Now we figure out what comes next. What came next was slower and quieter than any dramatic resolution I might have imagined in the dark of those first nights. My son and daughter-in-law began working with the financial advisor. The repayment arrangement with Gerald was restructured on realistic terms. My wife and I went back to our lives on the property in Bragg Creek, which was still ours, which had always been ours, which, as it turned out, had been legally protected for months before any of this had started, by a document that sat in Patricia's files in Calgary like a quiet, patient fact. I told my wife the full story of the trust on a Sunday morning in November. We were sitting on the back porch with coffee, watching the first real snowfall of the season come down soft and even across the back fields. She listened to all of it without interrupting, in the way she has always listened to me when something matters. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. July, she said. You did this in July. August, when it was registered, I said. She looked at me. While you were going to your appointments, while I was worrying about your test results, you were sitting in a lawyer's office making sure I would be protected. I didn't say anything to that. She reached over and put her hand over mine on the armrest of her chair. We watched the snow come down. You could have told me, she said. Not accusing, just observing. I know, I said. I was going to. I was waiting for the right moment. The right moment, she repeated. She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else. After 36 years, you still think I need to be protected from things. That's not I started. I know what it is, she said. She squeezed my hand once, and then let it go and picked up her coffee. You are impossible. I love you completely. Don't ever do that again. Do what? Carry something alone when I'm right here. I thought about telling her that she had done exactly the same thing, carried the knowledge of Gerald's visit for a full week before I came home. But I decided that particular observation could wait for another day. The snow kept coming down across the back fields, across the vegetable garden that was sleeping now under its white cover, across the roof of the garage that we had built together when our son was 16 and thought he was going to be a mechanic. 3 acres of the Alberta foothills that belonged to a trust, to a legal document that sat in a filing cabinet in Calgary and said, in formal language that cost us $800 to produce, that this was ours, that no one could take it from us through pressure or deception or through the desperation of someone who was supposed to love us. That evening, I cooked dinner while my wife read in her chair by the window. The same chair, the one that still felt wrong to me when I walked past it, though I knew that feeling would pass eventually. I opened the bottle of Riesling I had bought in Cochrane over a month earlier and had forgotten in the back of the pantry. I set 2 glasses on the kitchen table. She came in and saw them and smiled the way she has always smiled when she sees them. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. That's the thing I have been thinking about in the weeks since all of this ended. Not about Gerald. Not about what I had to do to protect what was ours. Not even about my son, who is working through what he needs to work through and whom I will love for the rest of my life without reservation. Because that is not a conditional thing. What I keep thinking about is how much time I spent in those weeks, operating alone, planning quietly, gathering information, saying nothing. All the skills I had learned in 30 years of running a business applied carefully and methodically to the most important situation of my life, and how none of it, not the trust, not Patricia's filing, not the letter to Gerald, none of it would have meant anything without the thing that was already there before any of it was necessary. The woman in the chair by the window. The 36 years. The wine glasses on the table. A man can be as careful and as strategic as he likes. He can protect every legal interest and prepare for every contingency. But the thing worth protecting, the actual thing, is not the property. The property is just the ground under the life. I think I understood that before. I think I understand it differently now. The snow was still coming down when we finished dinner, and I stood at the kitchen window for a few minutes watching it settle across the yard. The back porch light was on, casting a yellow circle on the white ground. "Come away from the window," my wife said behind me. "Your tea is getting cold." I came away from the window.